brilliant. So, Fáilte of Gachtainna. So my name is Aisling and I'm joined today by the lovely Jerry, all the way in Chicago. And thank you so much for coming on, Jerry. So Jerry's a new member on Bitesize GROW with us. It's been what now, maybe 2 months, 3 months with us?
2 months.
Yeah. And Siobhan had seen you a good bit on Bitesize Bio and had noticed that you're really enthusiastic and you have a really interesting background in Irish theatre and poetry. So I thought it might be interesting to chat to you about your journey with gaeilge. So thank you so much for chatting to me. And yeah, it must be very cold in Chicago now, is it? Very snowy and cold.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant. So do you want to introduce yourself as gaeilge for us?
Is Nisa Jerry. Is asan nastoit atehe dum. Tame imachoni I Chicago I America.
Yes, brilliant. And just as a warning, I don't know if it's coming across for you, Jerry, but there's a bit of a delay. So we're dealing with the lovely technical difficulties of Zoom and everything, but brilliant. That was excellent. So you have, as I mentioned, you have a background in Irish theatre and poetry. So that's what you studied in college. And was that what kind of led you to be interested in the Irish language, or where did it come from?
It did come from being really interested in the theatre and poetry that I was studying in university. I have several generations ago, I have some ancestors from Ireland, but I wasn't really raised culturally Irish or with a knowledge of the Irish language. So my own understanding of any of my ancestors comes much later, but I was really interested in university in the way that stories were told. And I just felt that there was such a connection to land and water that I've always really loved, but I felt like there was a different experience even in English and Irish theater and work. And the more that I started reading poetry specifically, I started seeing more translations happening side by side. And I was so curious to find out more. So I think the rhythm as well of what I hear in Irish, most of which I don't understand still at this point, but has been really interesting.
Yeah, I think it's funny, a lot of people might have read, English poets or read English plays from Ireland, and they might not even know that there's an Irish language. And then they hear it, or like you say, they realize, oh, that's actually been translated from Irish, and they decide to take an interest in it. And how did you start learning Irish? Where did you kind of begin your journey?
I took a month-long trip in college as part of my theater program to Ireland, and we traveled around. And so I noticed the signs in some areas, and I was able to go on a very short trip to Ballinasloe, which I believe is now features very prominently in the newer Star Wars movies. It was nice to say, oh, I've been there. And actually sitting on that island, I felt like there are names for each rock, and there's a name for the way that the water is crashing into the air on that island. And I thought, I don't have words for this in English, but I get the sense that these words are here. So between just seeing the signs and being on the land, I thought, this is where I want to start. And then was a little shy about it for a few years. So I looked into some language courses which are available here in Chicago. However, because I was such a beginner, I kept timing it poorly. So I wasn't able to actually sign up. And now that we're in lockdown, that was kind of the nudge I needed to really find a community online and find different ways of being able to pace and different ways in which I could come to the Irish language. So I'm still very new to it.
Yeah, that's really lovely. I've never actually heard of someone coming to the language through kind of that connection to nature that you talk about. And I don't know if you've read the book or heard of it, 32 Words for a Field. It's a new book out at the moment. It's all the rage, and it talks about the kind of way that Irish can describe things that maybe English can't. And like there is 32 words for a field and words for things that we might not know in English. So that's really lovely. And the fact that you kind of came to Ireland and experienced that on the ground is very cool too. And you mentioned as well that you learned Spanish. And how do you find the difference between the two learning? Do you think it's more difficult to learn Irish, or Spanish is easier? Which do you find?
I think at the beginning, I was really frustrated with my retention of Irish because I had forgotten how long it took me to um, be as conversational as I am in Spanish. I started learning Spanish in grade school, studied it in high school and at university as well. So I have decades at this point of Spanish learning, and it took me a minute to remember I didn't start speaking in full sentences in Spanish. And I was very shy at the beginning when I was learning, but I had the pressure of a school system kind of forcing me to engage.
Mm-hmm.
So a really lovely difference now is that I think the community on Bitesize is so welcoming and is much more generous with what I feel are my mistakes. And I think some of the similarities in the language I'm still uncovering. And I think when I see a similarity, my brain immediately goes, oh, that's not English, your first language. We know what to do with that, and kind of runs down the superhighway to Spanish. And so my pronunciation comes very funny, frequently in the middle of words. And again, people have been really generous with that. And now I just find it amusing. And I think it's taking more time as an adult learner for my brain to maybe form the connections and to say, it's not English, it's not Spanish, it's this whole other new beautiful country, and what does that look like? So there are some similarities I'm finding in grammar patterns between, but again, being very new, I don't know if maybe I'll find more irregularities further on. So I have found that for me, I need to write things out. So the bite-sized scripts for practicing language we get, I really struggled a few times until I realized I need I have a little artist easel and some scrap paper, and I write it out and I speak it as I write it. And that has been really helpful for me. And that is something that I did remember from Spanish. I need to have both the sound and the writing as I'm doing it. But I'm excited to find more differences and similarities as I go along. I think one of the advantages I had in Spanish was I hear the language on the street far more often here. I've, to my knowledge, not heard Irish spoken on the street. And so I think when I'm listening to different accents or different dialects, it's harder for me right now in the stage I'm in learning to know if it is a dialect or an accent change versus my memory having kind of saved the sounds incorrectly. So that I think is really fun to figure out what those differences are. And I'm excited to see any patterns between Spanish and Irish, but most of that is a mystery.
Yeah. Do you know what? I think it's so interesting because I have studied languages in college as well, and I then picked up German later on as an adult, and exactly like you said, my brain went straight to things I know, and I got so frustrated with myself when I didn't know it, and I was like, how am I supposed to know this? Like, I've never spoken this language before. And then the joy of being an adult learner as well is that you can say, okay, I don't have to be under pressure here to pass an exam or do anything. This is for fun. So trying to get rid of that kind of strict mindset of like, God, I don't know this, why don't I know this? And just saying, oh, this is cool, I don't know this is fun. So it's a very different approach definitely as an adult, and you kind of have to embrace all of the ups and downs of that. Brilliant. And you mentioned as well on Pubble that you kind of like to translate things yourself. You might like read a poem and try and self-translate. Do you think that's helpful as a learner to kind of diversify how you're learning and bring in some kind of interest of yours into your learning? Do you think that helps?
I think so. I think especially with right now in Chicago, we're under another lockdown. But even outside of that, I think it's helpful to diversify the sources. So listening to podcasts who are produced by different speakers and reading the transcription along, that was something that Shawan actually recommended on one of our bite-sized BO days. And I've been really thankful for her recommendation for that. That's really helped me. But I think with poetry, and actually one of the ones I've been working on, I have here, but the translations from English to Irish are all by different writers. So it's been really nice to say, oh, I know this word, but then when I see it again, the translation is slightly different. So that's been really, I think, an easy way to learn different options for words and for meanings especially. And I prefer using poetry than prose, partially because I write a lot of poetry in English. I also studied poetry. Rather than looking at a whole clump of text, poetry is frequently broken up into lines. And right now, as a new learner, it's so much more satisfying to say, I can break this down into units on the page and translate one line at a time. So, especially on days when I'm a little frustrated or there's a concept that is not integrating yet in my brain and the way I'm trying to use it, it's really helpful to go to poetry and say, I'm just going to look at one line, or I'm just going to look at one stanza, and I'm going to translate this and see if I can unlock this. And then it's really satisfying to do it that way.
Yeah. I think as well with poetry, what's lovely about it is that it's not concrete. There's no like one way to translate something, like you've said, with different writers translating it. So it gives you kind of more leeway in the language, I think, instead of saying, okay, well, this definitely means this. So, you know, it kind of, it allows you a bit more freedom to actually kind of communicate with the language better, if that makes sense, which is a really lovely way of doing it. And I think it's great that you're doing that now when you feel that you're just starting off, because it's such a nice way to keep going with the language. I think people maybe think of poetry as something that you kind of start to use or interpret into your learning when you're much further on, but it's really lovely to start off with it. So that's a brilliant tip. I'm definitely going to do that. If I ever go back to German, I'll do that. Brilliant. So what tips would you have for someone starting off learning Irish?
Listen to as much as you can. I think while some of the listening passive learning, whether it's radio programs on in the background or podcasts, I do think every so often I'll hear a word that I like the sound of or something that really piques my attention, and I'll go back and I'm finding that I am hanging on to those words that have organically piqued my attention much better. So I would also say most of these tips that I found really useful have been in bite-sized introductory courses. So I really recommend that course actually to find good tips. I right away started going to the conversation Tuesday conversations on BO, and I still feel very shy when I attend them, but I'm so grateful for going because I don't have access to Irish speakers on a regular basis. And especially right now, when I think much of the world is seeking connection that we don't otherwise have because of COVID and other things going on, it's really satisfying to feel like this language is actually a new way for me to communicate and be social. And it just has a much deeper and richer meaning than I was expecting when I first started learning. So even though, again, I feel very shy going, it's very rewarding, and I enjoy having that back and forth and that conversation. So I would say start speaking as soon as possible.
Yeah, that's really useful. And lastly then, you've kind of spoken about it a bit, so you don't have to go into too much detail, but how has Bitesize helped you in your learning? You spoke a bit about Bio and how you kind of jump straight into speech and everything, but do you think that kind of community is useful starting off as a learner?
Absolutely. I think I am so much more ready to engage in a bite every day of Irish because of the way Bitesize has set up the courses. And so it is easier to track that even when I'm frustrated, I am doing something, and I can say, oh, I have learned something, or, well, I didn't learn it, but I can go back to it because of the way this is all set up. So I can go back very easily. I also think I can't overstate enough just how generous community members have been when I've said, oh, I don't know that word. What is that? And it provides a space to ask kind of anything about Irish language and to find other people who might be learning at the same pace. And it's really exciting to see people who I think are far more confident and far more efficient speakers and listeners than I am, to hear how long they've been learning and say, oh, okay, they started from, about where I am probably, or some of them did at some point. So it's really encouraging and positive. And There are days when I feel very introverted and I don't need to engage kind of actively in the community, and that feels okay. And there are other days when I really want that social connection for the learning, and that community is already there. So it feels like the best of both worlds.
Yeah. And I think actually what you said about kind of, I think the structure of the courses is very complementary towards those days when you might just not feel like doing much at all, because they're quite short and everything is there for you. The sound bites are there. You can just kind of read through it and passively say, okay, fine, and then go back to it. And it's still not very daunting, you know. So that's great. And I'm really excited to see where you go with your journey, because I think you're probably very unique in your approach to the language. I've never spoken to someone or met someone who goes straight into literature to kind of enhance their learning, or listens to it in the way where they'll say, oh, that word is cool. That's a really lovely way to learn a language. And it's probably taking the kind of methodological side out of language learning and just making it a more of a spiritual and kind of holistic thing, which is really, really lovely. So thank you so much for sharing your time and your tips and your information and everything with us. And yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing you more on Hubble. So yeah, take care. Thank you so much, Jerry. Slán.
Go, Slán.